Hi, everybody. Mr. Rogers here, back with another one of my interviews with historians about the important topics that we are going to be covering in class. My previous one with Dr. Michael Haddam was about the Declaration of Independence. Today, I am joined by my friend, Dr. Andrew Fagal, to talk about the Constitution and part of Checkpoint 4. So what we're going to be talking about here is going to inform what we are going to be discussing, what we're going to be reading about when it comes to the Constitution, and why it came to be, how it was implemented, and some of its long-term legacies for our Checkpoint 4 work this week and into next week. But before we jump into that, I wanted to give Dr. Fagal an opportunity to introduce himself. So Andrew, why don't you tell the students who you are?
Sure, Roy. First, thanks for having me, and thanks for listening to me talk about Constitution for a little bit. My name's Andrew Fagal. I have known Roy for probably 5 or 6, 7, 8 years now, somewhere thereabouts.
Yeah, it's getting many years now.
Yeah, we were both entered grad school right around the same time. I finished my doctorate, 5 or 6 years ago, and since then I've been employed at Princeton University as an editor with the Papers of Thomas Jefferson. So what is that? We're a team that has been working since the mid-20th century to publish every single letter written to or from Jefferson over the course of his life. And about every year, we get out a volume about yay thick that covers a portion of Jefferson's life. So this most recent one, which came out earlier this year, volume 44, covers July to November 1804. So, that's just a few spans of Jefferson's life. And that's making sure that every word is properly misspelled from the historical record.
Yeah, and a lot of this is available online, right? So that people can learn more about figures like Thomas Jefferson, right?
It is, yeah. So our project, as well as ones that concern George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, they are all available through a website called Founders Online, which is put out by the National Archives of the United States. So if you type Founders Online into Google, it will be the first thing that comes up.
Cool. It's a really great resource that if you are interested in looking up some of the things that we're going to be talking about today and like what the people at the time, these big figures, thought about these big pressing political and social issues, it's a great resource. And it's also a great way if someone throws a quote on Instagram from George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, you can double check and find out that probably it isn't true.
Absolutely.
But definitely we should probably just jump right into it. But before we can really talk about the Constitution, I've got to ask you the question, why a Constitution in the first place? Why did the United States need one?
Yeah. So, that's really one of the most important questions with all of this is why a Constitution? And if you look at the history of the British colonies and European history for the centuries previous to the American Revolution, it's that written constitutions were not really a thing that existed. The British Constitution was an unwritten constitution. It was the sum total of all the laws passed by Parliament and all of the judicial decisions made by individual judges. There still is no British Constitution that you can, turn to and look up on the internet that says, here's the British Constitution. As part of the American Revolution, revolutionaries really wanted things clearly spelled out as to what the actual powers of the state governments were. And one of the first things they turned to after the Declaration of Independence is writing individual state constitutions that will govern how government actually works. What are the powers of the state and what are the rights of the people living in those individual states? The first national framework for a government was called the Articles of Confederation. And that was proposed in late 1776, but it wasn't actually finally ratified until 1781 because it required all 13 colonies to agree. And for a few reasons, Maryland was very unhappy with some aspects of the Articles of Confederation. So what the Articles actually did is it provided a framework for the governance of the United States, and it had its main body was the Congress of the United States, in which each state would have one vote. And it had fairly limited powers over foreign affairs and war making. It had no ability to tax, and that was a real problem coming out of the American Revolution, where the only powers that the Continental Congress had for raising money for war was to first print paper money, which soon became worthless, and then to take out loans from foreign governments in Europe, primarily France and the Dutch Republic. And so there was huge financial problems through most of the 1780s, and it was clear that without the ability to tax and collect money, that the Articles of Confederation government, the United States was going to remain a very weak power compared to the European governments. And so that was really the initial push for why many Americans thought that the Articles of Confederation needed to be reformed to make the United States stronger.
Absolutely. So would you say that the structural issues in the Articles of Confederation were one of the main driving forces behind the Constitution, or would you say that there were some other factors as well that contributed to the fact that they kind of basically threw out this, 10-ish, 20-year-old document and to create the Constitution? Because there's not really a one-to-one relationship between the old Articles of Confederation and the new Constitution that we know today.
Right. Yeah, no, there are a number of reasons that historians point to. The structural issues that I spoke about was just one of them. Another big issue is that the 1780s were a period of economic crisis for the United States. Some states, like New York, was doing very well. New York City, then as now, was a very important port city. And after the Revolution, New York was still getting a lot of business. North Carolina's economy was doing surprisingly well because they produced what was called naval stores. So the British Navy still needs turpentine, and the only place to get it is from North Carolina. So
pretty good.
North Carolina is staying in business. But places like Massachusetts, things are not looking so well. And one of the economic problems that a lot of these states face is how are the states themselves going to pay back their debts from the war? And so places like Massachusetts end up having these really strong taxation regimes that are designed to suck money out of common use so that they can then pay their foreign creditors. And so places like in Western Massachusetts, where they just don't have they did not have a lot of cash lying about, all of a sudden now you have people getting their farms foreclosed, and they rise up in a rebellion that's now called Shays's Rebellion, with the intention of closing the courts, and then they're going to march on Boston and try to force some essential reforms in the Massachusetts government. And the United States doesn't do anything about Shays's Rebellion. The only people to actually fight back against the Shaysites is the government of Massachusetts itself. It has no outside support from the United States government in putting down this rebellion. So there's financial issues, there's economic issues, there are issues just of basic security of if you have a bunch of angry farmers marching on Boston with guns, you might not like the system of government you have.
Definitely. And these tensions, I think, lead to sort of the next set of questions we want to address, which is, what form should this new government take, right? We have the structural issues that we talked about, issues within the Articles of Confederation, the fact that each state is represented equally. So, tiny Delaware is treated the same as big, powerful Pennsylvania here. Look at the map. Pennsylvania is infinitely bigger than Delaware, but they had the same representation and same power in the national government. But we also, what classes of people are going to have their voices heard is also a big structural question that is tied into those economic issues. When you have rebellions, when you have these tensions over, money and international credit, like what form the government takes, and particularly who gets represented and who doesn't, is a big one. So, boiling it down, what form do you think did the founders think that this new government should take?
Well, that depended upon which founder you ask, really. So the initial call comes in 1786 from, it's based off of a motion that Virginia puts through in the Continental Congress, saying that, hey, we ought to consider revisions to the Articles of Confederation. And there's a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786 to discuss possible revisions. But it turns out that, hey, not enough people show up to the Annapolis meeting. We're going to postpone this for another year in Philadelphia in 1787. And prior to that, there's really only, is that people come from 12 of the 13 states. Rhode Island decides not to attend, and you have really only two people coming up with pre-made plans to the convention. One of them is Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, and the other is James Madison. And it's James Madison's plan, known to historians as the Virginia Plan. That's really the most important of the two, because that really forms the framework of how the founders go about debating the different aspects of the Constitution in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And so what Madison proposes is essentially a remaking, not just amending the Articles of Confederation, but throwing them out entirely and coming up with a new national system of governance at the federal level. And so what that entails is a bicameral legislature, meaning a House and a Senate, but ones that are going to both be representative of the populations at large. So if Virginia is 20 times larger than Delaware, then Virginia will have 20 representatives in the lower house. Delaware will have one. And in the upper house, Virginia will have 20 representatives, and Delaware will have one representative as well. There's a relatively powerful executive branch in Madison's formulation, as well as a separate and independent judiciary, which was something that the Articles of Confederation did not have.
Yep, I mean this should sound familiar to us, right? Like this is in many ways the skeleton of of what was passed. I mean, we'll talk more about the details and how it changes, obviously, particularly with we don't have that equal bicameral but equal representational scheme. But one of the things that's really cool, I think, about this, and something we can take away from it, is Madison shows that if you come to a meeting with a plan, you can do a really good job of setting the agenda, because he was everyone had all these ideas, but Madison was the only one who came. Well, not obviously, you mentioned someone else, but his was the most straightforward plan, and that let him, the debate in many ways happened on his terms and addressed a lot of the issues that Madison thought were most important, versus maybe some other people may have thought. But Madison was prepared, and he was able to sort of push out some of the other point of views, which I think was one of the cooler things or more interesting things about the Constitutional Convention. But let's talk a little bit about what happened once Madison's plan starts to get debate. Students may have heard of this thing called, the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. There's like a million great compromises in American history. So what was that?
Sure. So before I get to the Connecticut Compromise, I'm going to, jumping ahead and also filling in a gap that I left out, is that one of the big things that's connected to representation is what's called apportionment, meaning the amount of taxes that have to be paid by each individual state into the national government. And so before there's, as they're debating Madison's plan, the question then arises, well, how do you count population in the states? Do you include enslaved people in the total population of those states, or do enslaved people count as property and not as people? And so this is important because the way in which the Continental Congress in the 1770s and the 1780s tried to decide issues of taxation was by just was by the population of each individual state. So, okay, if we want to raise $10 million and Virginia represents 50% of the population of the United States, Virginia is on the hook for $5 million of this $10 million. Mm-hmm. Because the Continental Congress didn't have the power to enforce any of that stuff, Virginia might say, here's $3 million, and you'll be happy to get that $3 million. Mm-hmm. But this, so while they're in the process of debating aspects of Madison's Virginia plan, is when they come up with the idea of the 3/5 compromise of how do you take into consideration the enslaved population of most of the states. And it's important to remember that at this point, slavery is legal in most of the states of the Union. It's only illegal in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Places like Pennsylvania in 1780 had put slavery on the road to a gradual abolition through a gradual Emancipation Act. but it's still legal throughout the Eastern Seaboard for the most part. And so, what the real problem for these guys is how does a state like Virginia or South Carolina with a large slave population, is that fully counted for the amount of taxation that they are going to have to contribute to the national coffers? And then, so from the northern perspective, is that you don't want to count enslaved people as persons for this, because if you do, then yes, Virginia will have to pay higher taxes, but they're also going to be getting a lot more representation. And the people who are theoretically going to be represented, enslaved population, they're not voting.
And they're not represented, right? Really.
Right. Well, they would be represented if they were getting full right. I mean, they're not actually getting represented.
Right.
But if they're counted as persons, theoretically they're getting represented.
Right.
And so there's one Massachusetts delegate named Albert Gerry, who gives one speech about, if we're going to, if we start counting enslaved people as property, then why not count other, basically other farm implements and all forms of property as contributing towards wealth, because that can all be taxed in the future. And so the initial decision that they come up with was something that had first been proposed under the Continental Confederation in 1783, was that, okay, we will count enslaved people as 3/5 in determining relative numbers of population, as for apportionment of both representation and tax amounts. So that was a fairly early compromise that came out of the proposal of the Virginia plan. So now to get back to the Connecticut Compromise that you mentioned, there were a lot of people in the Congress who were not happy with Madison's plan, and that would be people who happen to live in places like Delaware and New Jersey. If Rhode Island had sent delegates, Rhode Island would not have been happy with the plan either. And so what they came up with was something by a New Jersey delegate by the name of William Patterson called the New Jersey Plan. And Patterson's plan was essentially what the Continental Congress had originally instructed members at the convention to do, provide amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And so that's how Patterson pitched his plan, to appeal to both the legal-minded people like Luther Martin of Maryland, who's saying, you can't revise the government. Madison can't revise the government because that would be illegal and beyond what the Confederation Congress asked us to do. But also, it's going to provide more powers for our small states by keeping the principle of one state, one vote in the national legislature, but also giving the national government the power to tax and the power to regulate commerce, which is what they were looking for to solve some of these structural financial issues coming out of the Revolution.
Right. So what forces? Because what you said about the 3/5 compromise is super important, and we're going to get to it in a second. But what do you think? What do you think pushed people together to create that? The Connecticut Compromise we mentioned before. So what forces were the ones that sort of made it possible to create the government that we have today, which I just want to remind people, right? We have a lower House of Representatives that's based on population, representation based on population, and then a Senate that is, 2 senators per state. What forces pushed them together to create this?
Well, so Congress is essentially deadlocked for about a month. In July, where if you've been in Philadelphia in July, it's humid, it's hot. You don't want to be in anywhere that's not air conditioned, and air conditioning doesn't exist at this point. So it's not a fun time to be in the city. And tempers are hot, and you have both sides coming to loggerheads. And this is where the Connecticut delegation, led by Roger Sherman, comes in with a compromise that is ultimately successful of how do we resolve some of the concerns of the small staters like Robert Patterson of New Jersey, but also big overarching view of a person like Madison. And so what Sherman's proposal essentially is what you were just talking about, of this modern framework of how the government is actually, and that's the idea of a bicameral legislature held over from Madison's plan, but one where it's the House of Representatives that is going to be, based off of the populations of each individual state, and in the Senate, the upper house, 2 representatives per state. So it's not one state, one vote. Instead, it's one state, 2 votes, but each individual gets to vote however they choose. There's going to be a president that's essentially going to represent the people as a whole in a separate branch of government. And there's also going to be carried over from, I think both plans have the idea of having a separate judiciary as well. So that's something that they both agree on.
And the House and Senate being relatively co-equal is, I think, another important thing, right? That they both are a veto point for legislation. I mean, we're not going to get into the details if you've taken the civics class with me about what the specific House powers are and what the specific Senate ones are. But for any law to become a law, it has to pass both, right? Which is really important as part of the compromise, right? So that, people who were skeptical of the population plan wouldn't be overridden, and the people who were really resistant to the state representation plan would also not be entirely overridden. So it is really a compromise in the classic sense of that, where you sort of are pulling for each ideas and giving everyone a little bit a taste of what they want, and canceling out some of what the things that their opponents thought. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the classic phrase is checks and balances.
Yes,
and so even within it's generally thought of, the executive has a check on the legislative branch through a veto. But even within the legislative branch, there's checks on the power of population versus states working right there. Similar things working with the Electoral College, which we may or may not.
Well, I think we can put the Electoral College a little bit to the side. Although it is related to what the next thing, because I do want to double back to what you mentioned before about the 3/5 clause, which is probably the most famous part of the original Constitution at this point. Even though it's been excised, thankfully, from the document now, thanks to later amendments, but it is probably the thing that's most talked about the original Constitution. So let's dig in a little bit more about that relationship between slavery and the Constitution. It's definitely something that when Andrew and I were in graduate school is probably the most debated issue about the Constitution with historians today and in the public, right? The 1619 Project, where if you took my American history class last term, my African American history class last term, we read the introductory essay, and that's an important theme in her essay about it. So what is this? How did the 3/5 clause play out once that compromise was reached, both about representation but also about taxation?
Right. So how it plays out, it plays out in a couple of different ways. And, also important is this, the question that you asked is, what is the relationship between the Constitution and the institution of slavery? Because the 3/5 compromise is just one of 11 different clauses of the Constitution that are either explicitly or implicitly about slavery. So it is important to note that the Constitution never explicitly says slave or slavery in the text of it. But the phrase that's used in the 3/5 compromise is all other persons.
It's doing a lot of work.
Right, it's doing a lot of work. But it's important because when it's talking about the people who are represented are the free population of the state. So if you're a free black person living in Virginia, your vote is counted fully for both representation and taxation purposes. But an enslaved black person in Virginia is counted as 3/5 of a person for taxation and representation at the national level. Whereas in Massachusetts, where there is no slavery, black people are counted fully as people from the very beginning in the Constitution. So what Roy was talking about is, historians talk about this point. And one of the things that they discussed and trying to figure out is, was the Constitution a pro-slavery document, or was the Constitution an anti-slavery document. And so I mentioned that there are, 11 ways that, slavery either explicitly or implicitly comes up in the Constitution. One example of that would be the Constitution's prohibition on export bounties. That's in Article 1, dealing with the powers of Congress. I think it's in Article 1. I could be wrong on that.
I think it is in Article 1, if I remember from the last time I read this, so yeah.
Yeah, so anyways, Congress does not have the power to pass an export bounty. So what does that mean? An export bounty is a tax on any exported goods. Well, what are the regions of the country in 1787 that are exporting goods for the most part? And that happens to be the slave South, where in Virginia it's tobacco, in South Carolina it's indigo and rice. Cotton is not yet the big staple export. And so this is the export bounty is in many ways a concession to the slave South of, there will be no federal taxes on this type of economic commerce. There's arguments, the Connecticut is very much in favor of export bounties either. So it's not strictly a slave versus free dichotomy that's going on within the Constitutional Convention, but it's certainly an aspect of it. But there are other ways as well. One of the most significant ones, especially for how American history plays out, is the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And that mandates that if a person is legally enslaved within the confines of one state, and that they are found within the confines of another state that does not recognize the institution of slavery, that person has to be legally delivered up the law. And so Roy, I'm sure you're going to get to there's a Fugitive Slave Act in the 1790s, and that's most of the law of the land until 1850. In 1850, there's a big one that really coerces local sheriffs and things like that into basically acting as slave catchers. And that's one of the things that helps lead to the dissension that leads to the Civil War. So the Fugitive Slave Clause is another big example. Another one is the prohibition on the slave trade. So after the 3/5 compromise is agreed to, there's this question as to whether or not the slave trade will be banned at the federal level, or if the Constitution will make no provision regarding the slave trade. And so once the 3/5 had been agreed to, is that people realize that if the slave, especially Northern delegates, realize that if the slave trade is allowed to continue, Southerners can literally just import votes and increase the representational power in the national government without actually having to give any representation to these enslaved Africans. And so that becomes a big sticking point. And what ends up getting as to, in South Carolina and Georgia, their representatives basically say, if there's a ban on the slave trade in the Constitution, we walk. We're not going to be part of the union. And they leave an opening, saying like, look, we South Carolinians, we might choose to have our own ban on the slave trade. And it's also important to note that most states did have a ban on the slave trade by this point in 1787.
The international slave trade, just to be clear.
The international slave trade, right. Basically, vessels coming from Africa to continental North America. And it is, this is a real sticking issue. And what they come up with is initially, okay, Congress will have the power to ban it after the year 1800. That gets moved. There's an initial discussion. One of the South Carolina representatives, makes a motion to substitute in 1808 for 20 years after the ratification of the document. And so, it's only until, federal government is constitutionally prohibited from banning the international slave trade until 1808. So that makes it into the Constitution itself. So, this all gets back to this question of, is the Constitution pro-slavery, anti-slavery, what is it? And so if you were to argue that, the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, you'd have a fair amount of evidence on your side of it is allowing for the continuation of the slave trade for at least 20 years to the United States. A period in which, I think, there's very good numbers available through the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. I mean, it's at least 100,000 individuals are enslaved and brought to the United States in that time frame. It's people saw what was coming there, and the argument is that had these Northerners really cared about the issue, they could have called South Carolina and Georgia's bluff and gotten the Union without a slave trade. I don't know if that's true or not. We can't go back and ask counterfactual like that, and one should never underestimate the willingness of South Carolina to go it alone in any of this stuff. But so there's that. There's the Fugitive Slave Act, which is the Slave Clause, which is a big one, and the 3/5 compromise of the mere fact that the enslaved population is getting counted for white Southern representation in the national halls of Congress. These are all big things.
Fueling their own enslavement, right? Like that's the trap there, right?
Yeah, exactly. Fueling their own enslavement. And so, the counter argument to that is by not actually putting the word slavery in the Constitution, they were looking for the framers of the Constitution themselves, who were opposed to the institution of slavery in various, to varying degrees, understood that they would be making an argument for the ages, for the gradual abolition of slavery. And this is something that Abraham Lincoln later turns to in his Lincoln-Douglas debates in the 1850s to say, look, the anti-slavery cause in the United States can continue to rely upon the Constitution as its formative document because it never says the word slave there, because the founders understood that if you put that word in the document and recognize the institution of slavery at the federal level, then the entire document itself would have no legitimacy at all. And because it does not appear there, that implies that the federal government does in fact have the power to regulate the institution of slavery in areas where it has competent legislative authority. And by the 1850s, that's specifically talking about the territories of the United States, not the individual states themselves. And so that's important because that's the whole framework of division between the North and the South in the 1850s is over the spread of the institution of slavery to the Western territories in the 1850s. So, that's going to be the big issue for them.
Yeah. And, and I think this is one of those things that it's a question that students and obviously historians have to make up their own mind, right? About, and we'll be talking more in class. Part of Checkpoint 3 is looking at some of the parts of the Constitution that Andrew mentioned there, and coming to your own conclusions. Andrew and I both have strong opinions about this. I definitely am the kind of person who tends to view the document as much more pro-slavery than other people, but many people from Lincoln and Frederick Douglass to present view it as an anti-slavery document. It's kind of one of the questions that remains fundamentally unsettled in our history, is what the relationship between the Constitution and slavery is. And I really do invite the students that are listening to this when we're working on Checkpoint 3 to really think about this, because there's reverberations in both directions from the decisions that are made in Philadelphia, right?
Right. I mean, look at you mentioned the 1619 Project earlier, Roy. I mean, just the if you go on the internet and type in 1619 Project, you'll hit hundreds of websites and people talking about, about this issue, and that it's well contested, with good arguments on both sides, which is really indicative of, the type of question that, is something pro or con, can get you to.
Yeah, definitely. So besides the relationship between slavery and the Constitution, which is probably the most famous part of the Constitution, as was originally written, there's something we haven't mentioned at all, but it's the thing that Americans bring up all the time when it comes to the national government and our Constitution. With what's going on with the COVID crisis, this is coming up all the time today, and that is the Bill of Rights.
Oh, yeah.
Where is the Bill of Rights in all of this? And it has actually things to do with the slavery question as well that we were talking about. So where's the Bill of Rights?
Well, where's the Bill of Rights in 1787? It's not there.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is no Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
What happens at the Constitutional Convention itself is that one Virginian, George Mason, who's there, towards the end of it, says, "Hey, this whole document should probably be prefaced with the Bill of Rights, where the national government will recognize the rights that are inherent to the people themselves, that exist outside of the powers of the state." And the argument that is pushed back against Mason very forcefully in the Constitutional Convention is that, look, the Constitution is a limited grant of sovereign state power by the individual states to the federal government itself. Anything that is not explicitly in the purview of the Constitution is therefore not applicable. So take something that, freedom of the press, a big one. There's nothing in the Constitution itself until the Bill of Rights explicitly recognizing the freedom of the press. I think there's an exception over whether or not you can tax books that are being imported for educational institutions. I mean, that's kind of not really related to the principle of freedom of the press. What if you have a war in the future? Congress is clearly capable of waging war. Well, then would Congress, under its authority, have the ability to suppress unpopular newspaper opinions during or after that war? And so people who are reading the Constitution when it's first come out but has not yet been ratified by the states start asking these kinds of questions over, this is a big grant of authority from our individual states to this national government. What is to ensure that this national government will continue to respect our individual natural rights? Because many of the individual states that have their own constitutions, they also have their own individual bills of rights and statements of rights that are within their own constitutions. So, it's not as if, prior to that, the English Bill of Rights going back to the 1680s, this is one of the first statements of, go back to Magna Carta in 1215.
Oh, yeah.
They're one of the first statements. But, in the world in which they're operating, bills of rights had gone hand in hand with written constitutions for the last 10, 15 years of American history time in 1787, 17. And so in debating the Constitution and whether or not individual states should ratify it, you get a couple of states early on, like Delaware, Pennsylvania, they agreed to ratify the Constitution, no problem. But the argument of these anti-federalists who are starting to question the powers and reach of the state itself, start critiquing it for not having a Bill of Rights and not having these explicit protections of individual liberties written into the document. And so at a number of the individual state ratifying conventions, it looks like the Constitution might actually lose. So Massachusetts is an example of this. New York is another one. And these conventions, they end up deciding that, the argument is that, well, if we don't pass this Constitution, there is no United States. The Articles of Confederation are just not working out whatsoever. And so they, again, work out essentially a compromise position of, we will agree to ratify this. We will agree to ratify the Constitution if it is amended to include a Bill of Rights. That, they don't say what that Bill of Rights should look like or what it should encompass, but that's something that ought to be done. And I mean, some of these big ones of freedom of speech, freedom of the press,
The search and seizures.
Search and seizures. No quartering soldiers in your house.
The Third Amendment, Mr. Rogers' favorite amendment, the one that kids we always skip. It's like we do it in civics. We go First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth. They're like, what happened to the third? I'm like, don't worry about the third.
Yeah, it's the
most important one.
Most important one. No can't quarter our soldiers in our houses in this quarantine.
No, they cannot do that.
No, they cannot. Think about it. Military bases.
Yeah.
Very crowded. Lots of people in one spot. Wouldn't it be nice to spread them out amongst the population?
I mean, it is an interesting point. One of the reasons why we have military bases in the sense that we have them today is because of the Third Amendment. Because older armies, I mean, this is really going to the weeds, but it's the kind of stuff I find fascinating. Older armies literally did put soldiers in people's houses when they were hanging out. They didn't have military bases the way we do, but the development of that comes from the Third Amendment. But we should probably talk about more important things about this. But so would you say that this might be one of the first examples in American history of like politicians actually following through on their campaign promise, because they actually do enact the Bill of Rights, right? Well, I mean, we have it, right?
Yeah, I mean, they do. So this is something that comes up at the first Congress. Basically, James Madison, who is one of the big players at the Constitutional Convention, he is elected to the first Congress as a representative from Virginia. And he is essentially tasked with coming up with the first draft of the Bill of Rights. His framework is essentially, our modern framework, only his what our First Amendment now is what was his Third Amendment in that original draft and framework. It's approved by Congress after debate. Various of the different 10 amendments to the Constitution, which become what's called the Bill of Rights, are debated to various degrees in Congress. They're passed and they get sent out to the individual states for ratification. And by 1791, enough of the states now operating under the Constitution of the United States ratify the Bill of Rights, and it's adopted as amendments to the Constitution the first time.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things, right, about the Constitution is that it includes a provision for its own amendment, right? And that's something that is a big American political tradition, is we have a huge number of amendments. And, if I remember correctly, the Articles of Confederation didn't have a built-in mechanism to amend itself, right? So
that's why they had to call that convention.
Call the convention, and it was very unclear about how they could do that. Which brings us, I think, around to sort of the biggest picture question here, which is, like, what do you think the legacy of the Constitution is? I mean, obviously, it's still our operating framework to today, but, like, thinking about the original Constitution that we're learning about in this class, what do you think is the legacy of the original Constitution?
Yeah, legacy of the Constitution, that's a big one.
I know. And make it accessible to high school students, Andrew. Let's see if we can do it. I'm throwing you no more softballs.
All right. So I'd say that there are probably two things to really consider here. The first one is what you just said, is that it's still the basic governing document of the United States. And that's really its legacy, is that it's worked out more or less pretty well for 230 years. Not many things are built to last that long.
Yeah.
The more or less part.
The less part is where we get to the trouble.
Right. Is one of the ways of thinking about American history. And so if you study French history and the history of French republics, there's the First Republic, there's the Second Republic, the Third Republic, the Fourth Republic, and the Fifth Republic. And these republics are all centered around different major constitutional changes in representative democracy in France, from the French Revolution through the Fifth Republic is started in the 1950s. And so if you think about, how the Constitution changes, and how the governing systems of the United States changed over time, is that the original Constitution of 1788 that's ratified is, that's the Second Republic of the Americans. The first one is under the Articles of Confederation, and that didn't last very long as national government. And then early on, after the ratification of the Constitution, is that you got to have the Bill of Rights. So that, changes some parts of it. But perhaps more important are the other two initial amendments, the 11th and the 12th, which, recognize some of the initial flaws of how this document should work. Because when they're writing the Constitution, they don't anticipate political parties. Mm-hmm. And this is how you get, two frenemies, really, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, being president and vice president in the late 1790s, and the headaches that caused in government. And so when you get to the election of 1800, you have strategic party voting going on in the House of in the Electoral College, and it turns out there's a tie between Jefferson and Burr. No one thought Burr should be president of the United States, but by the rules of the game as set out by that original Constitution, Burr's got an equal shot, so it goes to the House of Representatives, and it's only after about a month of going back and forth that Jefferson ends up winning. And so the 12th Amendment, recognizes that, in changing the ways in which presidents are elected under the rules of the under the
Constitution.
Under the Constitution, right? The Electoral College.
There we go, Electoral College.
Five big things going on in my brain at once.
Oh, no problem. We're heady stuff here.
Is that, it recognizes that there's essentially going to be political parties in American history. And then the Constitution remains unchanged until the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, when you get three big amendments that abolish slavery, equal protection under the law, and protecting the rights of Black men to vote. This again fundamentally changes the nature of Constitution of national governance in the United States. And the 14th Amendment has a very long life. It's probably the most important amendment to the Constitution of equal protection under the laws going forward. In the progressive era in the early 20th century, the progressive era amendments, women's right to vote 100 years ago. Again,
the tax we all pay, the income tax. That's
the income tax. Yeah, I mean, there's a reason. Tariffs. I mean, everyone's probably heard. Roy, when you and I were in high school, did we ever think about tariffs or talk about tariffs?
I think, if I remember correctly, in my Civil War history class in high school, we learned about tariffs. But I mean, that could just be me reading my knowledge of tariffs back to a younger version of myself. So.
Yeah. No, but we never talked about it.
No.
Right? Now in American politics, it's all about tariffs again. So, some of these things come around. And if you were living prior to the income tax amendment, the tariff is the primary way that the federal government raised money. So, more things change, the more they stay the same in some ways. But the income tax is, it's a big change. And then coming out in the 1960s, there are a number of greater amendments, changing the voting age to 18, but also then you get different political movements like Roosevelt's New Deal, which is at first struck down by the Supreme Court and then later upheld, that in other ways remake American history as well. So one of the things to think about history as a discipline is the extent to which things change over time versus how things might stay the same. And so one of the ways of thinking about the legacy of the Constitution, to get back to the first thing I said, is that how durable it's been over 230 years. Well, it's been durable in part because of this ability to amend, and to reflect that when you do have these big, issues of national concern, you can get national level change, and that's big.
Yeah, and I think also one of the important legacies, and I think that this is both a good and a bad legacy that's related to what you're saying, is particularly if we go back to where we're talking about how the word slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution. Constitution is purposefully, and sometimes impurposefully, vague on a lot of things, right? And it lets it be very flexible. And that, to me, is and the thing that, you can... And today you can read, blogs, watch Fox News versus what is on MSNBC, and they are talking about the same document, quoting the same words, but justifying radically different social, economic, and political policies. And that is the fact that it is a very slim document that can be read, in a very short period of time, particularly because there are parts of it you can skim over once you start looking at it, is one of its biggest legacies.
Are oftentimes things that are very clear. Yeah. So, no one talks about a bill of attainder. No one even knows what a bill of attainder is.
They should be glad that they don't know what a bill of attainder is.
Right, yeah. Be very glad you don't know what a bill of attainder is. But in part because, no power for Congress can, no bills of attainder anymore. Boom. In the Constitution. Okay. That's society. Can't have that. So, yeah. And then in certain aspects, of the Constitution, a little vague. And then how it's initially interpreted in the 1790s is what leads to the rise of the two big political parties in American history, the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists. And that's over a whole host of issues, one of which is how to interpret the Constitution and powers of the federal government. But that is a topic for another lecture.
It is definitely a topic for another lecture. And I want to thank Dr. Fagal for joining us today. And I think this was a really great discussion, a great overview of some of the issues around the Constitution, its origins, its impact. And I even forced Andrew to talk a little bit of presentism too, which is, not necessarily his natural point of view. So I really appreciate you joining me today, Andrew.
Yeah, I don't mind. I wouldn't. It's not for me, but I'm happy to talk about it.
All right. Well, just to do the teacherly part of this, make sure, of course, that you look over the study questions that are going to be attached to the description of this video. Make sure you answer them, and that will help you, again, with Checkpoint 3, which is the major assignment that you're going to be working on from. And make sure you pick one of the themes that we talked about today for Checkpoint 3, and you can use what Dr. Fagal and I talked about here as part of the evidence in your answer. So, but until then, until I next speak to you, Andrew, but also until I next speak to you, students, stay safe and stay healthy.